Hello, everyone. I'm Hadar Susskind. I'm the president and CEO of New Jewish Narrative. Thank you for being with us for this webinar today. Hello to our guest, Ambassador Dan Shapiro. Dan, before we started off, I'm sure most folks on the call know you, but just in case, Dan is a distinguished fellow at the Atlantic Council right now, having previously been Deputy Secretary of Defense for Middle East and what was it, Senior Advisor on Regional Integration at the State Department, as well as being at the NSC, and of course, having served as U.S. Ambassador to Israel under President Obama. Dan and I, frankly, go way back long before that to when he worked for Senator Nelson, Senator Feinstein, and maybe a couple of other senators in there too. We are all obviously here today to talk about what is going on between Israel and Iran, and I would say Israel and Iran and the United States, because we want to talk about that element again. And when we started to think about who we wanted to bring in here, Dan was our first choice as somebody who has spent a lot of time in senior roles within the U.S. government, a lot of time in Israel as ambassador, working with political leaders there, and with leaders sort of across the range and political stripes here in the U.S. So, Dan, we are grateful for you for joining us. Hello, thank you. How are you? Oh, and
It may
maybe.
have been.
Oh, hi, you were frozen there.
Can you hear me? Okay. Do you hear me okay now? There was a little glitch on the incoming. So,
Yes,
uh,
I got you now.
great. Okay. Great to be with you. Great to be with the New Jewish Narrative audience and members. So, yes, lots to talk about on Iran, on the Israeli operation, on potential U.S. Decisions ahead. So, I'll just accept the welcome, and we'll take the conversation wherever you want to, Hadar.
Great, thank you. So the first thing I want to say to everybody is, this is obviously a very difficult moment. All of us with family and friends and, deep connections to Israel are very worried about, our loved ones there and everybody else there. People are also quite rightly worried about, innocent civilians in Iran too, hundreds of whom have been killed already in this conflict. And I mean, I'm going to say, the conflict in Gaza continues, although it is not the focus of our discussion for today. It continues unabated there. So it is a difficult time, and it is a time where I think it's important. And I want to say that in my view, there's not a lot of black and white in what's going on here. There's not just this is the best and this is the worst, and we're over here and we're there. I think people have there's no doubt that Iran is a bad actor in the region and has supported terror for many years, and has repeatedly, constantly threatened the existence of Israel. And the Israelis attacked Iran on Thursday night, and people have different feelings about that and whether that was the right thing to do or not, whether it was a tactical thing to do, whether it was necessary because there was some different urgency to it. I guess, Dan, where I want to start is I've seen a lot of people that said, look, kind of those things. Yes, Iran is bad. Yes, they've been perhaps pursuing nuclear weapons, not just a civilian program. But we have heard from Prime Minister Netanyahu and from other leaders out there, for 30 years now that they're, weeks away from a bomb. And so is there something that made this moment different? And if so, what do you think that is?
Thanks. Yeah, so I think the moment's a bit different, and I'll go through why. I mean, it is true. Everything you said, of course, is true. I won't repeat it all, but let's be clear about what we're talking about, who we're talking about here. The Islamic Republic of Iran, the regime that governs it under the supreme leader, Ayatollah Khomeini, is very open about its ideology. It's very open about its aspirations to wipe Israel from the map. These are their words, not mine. It has spent decades and billions, probably tens of billions of dollars, arming and training and supporting and financing a network of terrorist proxies on Israel's borders to conduct those attacks. It's done more than that, of course. It's been hostile towards the United States. It has a great deal of Israeli, American, Arab, and Iranian blood on its hands. So there's really, I just think it's important to level set who we're talking about here and what we know about what they say in their own words that they want to do. Now, it is also true that they've had this nuclear program for also some decades, and it has gradually developed. And they have always asserted they don't intend to build a nuclear weapon, and yet they do the things that there's really no civilian requirement to do in order to have peaceful nuclear energy or nuclear materials for research or medical purposes, and that no state that doesn't have nuclear weapons pursues. Now, it is true that Prime Minister Netanyahu himself and other Israelis have warned for many years that they're close, they could be getting closer, et cetera. And there's a whole range of things that Israel has done and the United States has done, and we've done together, and some international community actors have contributed to, that have actually delayed us getting to the sort of moment of truth about that program. Negotiations like the JCPOA, sanctions, and other more coercive means of punishing them or making it hard for them to get certain materials, or even sabotage and covert operations. There's a whole range of things that we and Israel and others have done over 2 or 3 decades to, extend the timeline out. And it also may be true that the Iranian preference has been to inch forward, to keep it below the threshold, below the radar of actual concern that they're right on the cusp of a nuclear weapon, but get closer and closer to where they have the ability to do it when it's a time of maximum opportunity for them at a time of their choosing. So just those are, I think, important kind of historical context points. Now, what's changed in this situation? What's changed in my mind is the three things have changed. One is that the program has advanced significantly. Now, one can say that the reason the program has been able to advance in this period of time is because the JCPOA, which was signed in 2015, imposed various limits for about 10 to 15 years, and we're now in about year 10 of them, and that they would still not have gone if they'd stayed within the bounds of that agreement. They'd still have a much less robust program. The criticism of the JCPOA, of course, and there's some legitimacy to this, is that in another 5 years from now, the restrictions would have come off and they'd have legitimacy to build out a much more expansive program, and there's the so-called sunsets of those restrictions. And I always said when I was ambassador and people criticized the JCPOA in Israel, I said, it wasn't the perfect solution. It bought time, and buying time has value, but you also have to be aware that as that time runs out, you may have to do something else. Now, what happened in 2018, President Trump in his first term withdrew from the agreement. And after he withdrew from the agreement, Iran started to exceed their or violate their commitments. And they did some under him and more yet under Biden. And so, you can say President Trump bears some responsibility for this. I thought that was the wrong decision at the time. Nevertheless, we are where we are, which is that today, and this was documented just a few weeks ago by the International Atomic Energy Agency, Iran has about 10 bombs worth of 60% enriched uranium. It has the ability to enrich that to 90%, which is weapons grade, at any time. It would take them a few days to do one bomb, maybe a few weeks to do all 10. So there's no question they are, at the cusp of that capability. And we have always defined through multiple administrations breakout as when they have one bomb's worth of weapons grade uranium. Now they're basically there, or they could be there at any moment that they so chose. That's one. Now then there's this question of weaponization. It's a separate process to do the research and the physics to build the actual bomb that you'd place the enriched uranium into. And that's the area where there maybe is some dispute. The longstanding U.S. assessment was that they had such a program until 2003. They suspended it when the United States was going into Iraq. There's never been an order from the Supreme Leader to resume it formally or to build a nuclear weapon. And it's also true, and this I now have to sort of reference information that I was exposed to when I was in government. I was at the Pentagon until the end of the Biden administration. And what I understand has been even, some additional turns of that information in the time since I've left government. This is all classified. That they have been conducting activities and research, even without a formal instruction, that shorten the distance of time that they would need in order to build a weapon, if and when they get that order from the Supreme Leader. So, we're getting close to the knife's edge here. And I think that despite what we've heard that many times over the years, I think there are some objective facts about how quickly they could do that if they wanted to do that. That's number one. That's changed. Second thing that's changed is that last year, I was at the Pentagon during this, Iran on two occasions conducted overt state-to-state massive missile and drone barrages against Israel, real overt acts of war. Now, this war has been going on for a long time in some ways. I've definitely been telling everyone this war didn't start a week ago. The way it started years or even decades ago in what was sometimes known as the shadow war, the proxies I mentioned, and of course, Israel responding and trying to prevent weapons getting to them and prevent the attacks. But this was something new. We'd never seen this before. And of course, we in the Pentagon and our colleagues in CENTCOM were working to help defend Israel and organize a coalition to do it even in April, more or less just US and Israel in October, but to defend Israel from this really unprecedented, massive act of war. And that changes things, I think, when you consider how close they are to the ability to get a weapon at a time of their choosing and the ability to, or the clear intention now demonstrated to use these very powerful ballistic missiles to attack Israel. And I think from an American perspective and an Israeli perspective, you have to start to take maybe a bit more cautious approach about what you can permit them to have or how close you can permit them to get. Two other things changed just briefly, and then I'll turn it back to you. One is that a window of opportunity has opened. And this, I think, certainly motivates the Israeli thinking on it. After the October Israeli attack, of course, Israel responded very forcefully, and among other things, took out Iran's most sophisticated air defenses, their S-300 batteries that Russia had provided. And in doing that, they made Iran much more vulnerable to the kind of attack that's now gone on this week against nuclear sites and other sites. And I think, until before those were rebuilt and before Iran reestablished that air defense capability, I think there's a strong feeling in Israel, not just Bibi, the military and many others. And of course, you've seen this has had broad support across the Israeli system this week. Lapid, Golan, Gantz, they're all expressing support despite their many differences with Bibi. And that they shouldn't miss that opportunity to either through diplomacy or if not, then through military means now that they have that window open to attack. It's another major improvement in the strategic conditions for that are that Hezbollah was decimated in September. And so they didn't have to worry about that second strike of tens of thousands or more rockets and missiles from Hezbollah raining on Tel Aviv. That was always the deterrent that Iran had. They don't really have it. Hezbollah has said, at least until now, that they're staying out of this, and they definitely don't have what they used to have even if they decide to get in. So that's something else that's changed, that opportunity marrying up with the necessity. And finally, of course, what's changed is the mindset in Israel post October 7th that Israel can no longer permit a threat that it identifies to mature to the level that it is at the point of near certainty it may be used, and only at the last possible minute to engage to try to address that threat. That's one of the failures of intelligence and planning and vigilance that preceded the October 7th attacks. And again, across the Israeli government, military, intelligence, and I think society, there is a pretty widespread view that we cannot take that chance again. That's maybe leads to some overreach in places like Syria, and maybe it means that things don't move as fast on the opportunity to normalize with Lebanon and under the new government and things like that. But when you're talking about a state that's previously shown hostile intent and acted on it with ballistic missiles and now is getting closer and closer to that capability, I think it's an understandable conclusion from Israel. And this is different from the question of exactly when the operation should happen, how much time should it be given to negotiations, but to say, look, we're not going to let this come right up to the last possible minute because we might miss the last possible minute, and then that's just a threat we cannot tolerate.
Yeah, thank you. I think those of us who are following, Israeli press and what's going on in Israel closely, it is certainly true that, this offensive against Iran has very broad public support there. I think much differently than what you see here in the United States, again, for some pretty obvious reasons. But I think it is, it raises the question then of what should the U.S. role be? And, I think probably all of us on here have been very thankful for the U.S. Active role in defending Israel against those missiles and drones and others that came in October, that came in April. Um,
April.
yeah, April. And so there's a questions, and now we are sitting here with the Trump administration. Maybe 10 minutes before we got on here, I saw reports that President Trump had said something along the lines, I'm paraphrasing here, of he will decide whether the U.S. should directly militarily engage, should bomb Iran basically within the next 2 weeks. My very quick assessment is that that's not what the Netanyahu government was hoping to hear. I think they were hoping that the Trump administration would choose to do it much more quickly. I think there were a lot of people, including a lot of congressional leaders from both parties, who have been pushing back against the U.S. getting directly involved here. What do you think? What do you think are the considerations that the people sitting around the tables in the Trump administration right now are thinking about when they make these decisions?
Right. So first of all, just to state the obvious, it's not a normal administration, normal as in any previous administration that I'm familiar with, in terms of the interagency process, in terms of a bit more organized decision making. It's always the president's decision, but we know we're dealing with basically one individual, and the decisions will flow top down. And he talks to, I think, a very limited member of even his own team. Maybe he talks to some people on the outside too, but um, it's impulsive. It's a bit chaotic. I don't think he helps matters with some of the very well impulsive, let's call them, tweets that come out about threatening to assassinate the supreme leader, or insisting on evacuation of Tehran, a city of 10 million people, or unconditional surrender in all caps without any real knowledge of what that means. Right? This isn't helping. But that aside, let's try to talk about it in sort of more conventional, organized terms. Look, he came
Let's
in
pretend it's
and
normal.
has always said,
I said, let's just pretend
right,
it's because it's what we've. For the record, I don't mean we should
right.
pretend that it's normal, but it is what we have, so we have to deal with it. Sorry, you were saying.
So you have to analyze it in the real context, and also, yeah, okay. So he came in and he always said Iran can't have a nuclear weapon. That's a long-standing position through many administrations. Again, I think some of his own decisions in 2018 have brought us closer to this moment than we could have been. But again, we are where we are. And he said he wanted to do it through diplomacy, and it could be done, sort of through diplomacy, or it could be done through force. In his kind of blustery way, he said it. And actually, I've always felt that, and I think this is true even of previous administrations that I served in as well, that the threat of force has to be part of the diplomacy. Right? President Obama actually put in place a U.S. military option to take out Iranian nuclear sites that didn't exist when he came into office. And that was part of the leverage that brought Iran to the table and eventually got us to the JCPOA. There were sanctions, there were other things, but that's a legitimate tool. And in fact, I think he used it effectively. There was already a pretty robust U.S. military posture in the region based on everything that had happened since October 7th when he arrived, and he beefed it up mostly to deal with the Houthis, an Iranian ally or proxy. And he was, conducting that campaign against the Houthis. And at the same time, he was trying to draw Iran into the talks. And I actually think it focused the Iranians' mind. And normally they're very good at delaying and dragging out even the process to get to the table. And they really didn't. It really short-circuited that process. And within just a couple of weeks of the first overture, they had the first negotiations, which was good. Then they had a problem where they were not fully settled on what their goal was. They kind of started the talks before they even decided what they're trying to achieve. So there was that debate about, is it no enrichment? Is there some kind of limited enrichment, more like a JCPOA model? And we heard contradictory things from different administration officials, but then they landed, I think, ultimately on their position, which is there have to be zero enrichment. Maybe there are ways of giving Iran face saving, but that was really the requirement. Um, Oddly, once this talk started, I thought they downplayed the military option. Of course, the strikes against the Houthis ended, but you really didn't hear that as part of this discussion. And I think that was also something missing from the diplomacy in that period of April and May. I wrote about that. Um, it was probably always true that for those negotiations to have any chance of succeeding, because Iran's red line has always been, we insist on retaining an enrichment capability. It would come to a crisis. These talks don't just resolve themselves because everyone, shakes hands. There's a crisis, and the crisis might include the snapback of sanctions, that's a deadline in October to return sanctions that the Europeans can trigger because Iran's in violation of the JCPOA. It might, involve Iran taking some retaliatory step like withdrawing from the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and it might involve a threat of U.S. force, and maybe that's the moment. So I kind of thought that later this year, more like in the fall, we'd kind of hit that moment of truth, and there would be some of these same decisions. Now, the Israelis, of course, moved up this timeline. They fixed on the 60-day clock that President Trump had set. They said, we're coming to do this. Look, I think Trump had an opportunity, if he wanted, to give a red light to Netanyahu. And we don't know for sure what Netanyahu would have done if he had done that, but he could have said, and I think it was pretty clear he wanted more time, but he didn't do that. He said, I said 60, it's now 61 days, and this has started. And then, of course, he kind of waited to see, distance himself from it a little bit in the first hours, and then waited to see how it went. And Israel had a lot of success in the first hours and days. So he's been a bit more kind of associating himself with it ever since. But now we're at that moment of truth, right? Because Israel has done a lot of damage to important nuclear sites, Natanz enrichment facility, at least the above ground part, probably some in the below ground part as well, the Esfahan uranium conversion site, of course, to various missile production sites, missiles and launchers themselves, although many have still managed to come toward Israel, and some unfortunately have gotten through and caused casualties. Air defense, personnel, senior IRGC and military figures, nuclear scientists and the like. And probably the Israeli action to date, even if we put Fordo, the underground, very deeply buried underground site, to the side, has delayed or would delay Iran's ability to get back to where they were and put some time on the clock if they were going to try to go to a nuclear weapon, at least on the weaponization side. But Fordo, this deeply buried target or uranium facility where they enrich to 60% and have the ability, if they choose, to enrich to weapons grade and keep some of that material, still has to be addressed if you're going to meet the no enrichment standard. It has to be disabled or shut down one way or another. Now, there are three ways that can happen. One way is the Israelis have an answer to it. They don't have the bunker busting aerial bombs that the United States has or the platforms to deliver them. So they have shown a lot of ingenuity, a lot of creativity, and I don't rule out that they have some other solutions. They did pagers in Lebanon. They sent commandos into Syria. They smuggled drones into Iran. Like they might surprise us with some solutions. That's one possibility. A second possibility is, of course, the U.S. strikes, and that's what's being considered. And I think what President Trump has done to this moment he's given himself that option by putting in place the force necessary. In the last few days, a second aircraft carrier has sailed toward the Middle East, numbers of tanker aircraft and fighter aircrafts. These are all not for the actual strike itself, but for shaping the environment, for being prepared for responses, and so forth. But so that if he makes the decision, again, I don't think he's made it yet. Now it's pretty clear he hasn't. He's got everything in place. So then that's ready to go. And the United States has unique capabilities to do significant damage to that site. Destroy, I don't know if I will use that word, but dramatically limit its operational use for a very significant period of time. And then the third possibility is to use the leverage and the threat of that force, the Israeli, but also the American option, as or to use that threat as leverage for the diplomacy. We call that coercive diplomacy. That's a form of diplomacy. I mentioned it always. I felt needed to be part of this. And now it appears he's doing that, right? Everyone knows that this is under discussion. Everyone knows he's the only one who can decide, and he may decide now. His spokeswoman says it may be a week or two till he decides. And that's a window of time. That's a window of time to get Iran to come to the table and make concessions that they haven't been willing to make until now. Now, there's a meeting tomorrow in Geneva between the Iranian foreign minister and the European three, the German, French, and British foreign ministers. Perhaps a channel in which, if Iran's going to make an offer or a concession, it could be conveyed. There may be opportunities for others. Steve Witkoff may go to the region. So I actually think if it's done skillfully, and I'm not sure this is the team I would have chosen, but this is the team we have, that there is still an opportunity to achieve the very important objective. I think that's what I really want to stay focused on. What's the objective? The objective is, I think, the one they correctly chose eventually in the negotiations before the attack started, which was Iran can't have this capability to produce this weapon based on all the reasons I said that have changed and their own behavior. And so if it's going to be done by diplomacy, great. If it needs to be done by force, if necessary, okay. Do that in a limited way. Do that in a way that manages and mitigates the risk as much as possible. expand the mission, or let the mission creep into regime change and things like that. Keep it very focused. And then, as long as you're in a window and everyone knows that's a possibility, you have the possibility also of leverage and diplomacy to produce the outcome without the need for the strike.
So thank you for all that. And you got to exactly where I wanted to take the next question, which is what is the goal and the threat of mission creep? You know, both Israeli and American governments, like you said, have long had the policy that the Iranians cannot have nuclear weapons. That's clear from those two perspectives. But what we've seen more and more from Israeli leaders, not just somebody spouting off on the street, and from the U.S. is now this conversation about regime change also, and that I think honestly scares me personally. I mean, I think there's sort of big picture questions about whether any country should be in the business of regime change in another country, regardless of what that regime is. It's not defending them in any way, but also just the likelihood of getting yourself into a deeper if you take that on as a target, getting yourself into a deeper kind of conflict. I've been seeing things written by a lot of Iranian Americans, including Jewish Iranian Americans, talking about how they support, or well, the Jewish ones supporting the Israeli action and the bombing, the non-Jewish ones, even though they're Iranian Americans, because they hate the regime, right? These are all people who fled this regime, but are opposing the bombing, of course, because it's still their friends, their relatives there. Just as we know, you don't have to like the government in a country to not want to see it be bombed. But also, opposing the idea, people who want regime change, opposing the idea of regime change at the end of an Israeli or American sword, so to speak. Do you think that, that either of these governments are seriously sort of going down that path? And what do you think about the kind of the dangers around that?
Sure. I think the Israeli operation has not labeled regime change as one of its goals. They are clearly focused on disabling the nuclear program that involves the sites themselves and some of the key personnel that have the knowledge, and on the missile program. Of course, the missile program, we know the dangers because the missiles are coming to Israel. The one hit a hospital in Beersheba today. There have been casualties. And so they're trying to get the launchers, they're trying to get the production lines, they're trying to get some of the missiles themselves, they're trying to get some of the operational leadership and command structure that gives the orders for those missiles to be launched to slow that down. Those are basically the goals that I think they've articulated. Um, Look, when you go for IRGC leadership, you're also going after people who have been operating and funding and training all those terrorist proxies. So there may be an additional benefit to slowing or complicating Iranian support for that terror network, or that axis of resistance, as they call it. So I believe that's, first of all, correct. And I'll come back to the caveat on this in a second, that regime change should not be a part of this campaign. And it certainly shouldn't be part of any American operation. I think, as I said, we should stay focused on the objective, prevent them having the ability to have a nuclear weapon, and not try to get into that other space. And certainly nothing that would draw us in deeper. We're not talking about an Iraq or Afghanistan style event of 20 years ago with the long tail. We've learned a lot from that. Nobody, and I'm quite sure that, look, this is going to be, if the president decides to do this, it's going to be divisive within his own political base, right? In part because of people's concerns about us getting drawn into Middle East wars and things he said about that. And there are some legitimate concerns about that. And again, we have some bitter experience. But so I don't think that should be, and I, at least to this point, don't think that is. Now, of course, we've also heard Prime Minister Netanyahu, tweeting, maybe the defense minister as well, about certainly their antipathy for the regime, and a little bit of this calling on the Iranian people to do something. It's not quite a military campaign for regime change, but it sort of starts to blur those lines. If I were advising the prime minister, I'd say, I don't think you're the best spokesperson to get the Iranian people to sort of act against the regime.
Maybe
I
the
think
worst.
if they're, yeah, maybe, okay, if they're going to do it, right, that shouldn't be the frame. They're doing it at the call of the prime minister of Israel. So we'll see. I hope the Israeli systems remains kind of disciplined about what they're trying to achieve. I think the IDF is telling the political leadership that they need maybe another week or so to strike all the targets that they had selected for the originally stated missions. And so they're, from their point of view, they're sort of coming toward the wrap up to achieve that, minus the question of how do you deal with Fordo. Now, let me back up and say two other things. One is that kind of what I started with in the early part of this call. Let's remember who this Iranian regime is. I talked about their international aggression and against Israel, against others, their sponsorship of terrorism. They are also a deeply brutal, I mean, really quite hateful regime to their own people. People who are much smarter and more knowledgeable about internal Iranian politics and society than I am estimate that maybe 15 or 20% of Iranians actually feel that they're supporters of this regime. We know how brutal they are to dissidents, to women, to homosexuals, to various minority groups. We know that, again, they've sponsored all sorts of mayhem in other governments. What they've done in other countries, what they've really done is squandered, huge amounts of resources. And we're talking hundreds of billions of dollars over years that should have been used for the benefit of the Iranian people, for their prosperity and their security in the pursuit of these ideological objectives overseas, with the terror against Israel, undermining Arab governments, and of course the nuclear program, which has produced almost nothing for the Iranian people. It hasn't produced a deterrent. Look what's happening now, and it hasn't. It doesn't produce any meaningful amount of nuclear energy either. Something like 1% of the Iranian electricity is sourced from nuclear energy. So, they have. It will not be a sad day. It will be a good day when this regime disappears. And I want to say that openly, that I think I pray for the day that it's gone. But it's a decision and an effort that the Iranian people are going to have to figure out how to make happen. And look, when any regime changes, especially if it involves some kind of revolution, there's a risk of instability, there's risk of violence. And so again, decisions that Iranian people will have to make about how it affects their lives and their futures and so forth. And again, I pray for its demise, but it has to be done through those means. There's sometimes people approach this question not just from the question of should the U.S. or should Israel be in the business of regime change. I already told you my opinion about that. We shouldn't. But should we fear regime change? Should we fear it happening? And then you have to ask the question: could you have some instability? Yeah, sure. Look what happened in Syria. Like, could you have a revolution? Could you have a civil war? Could you have all of those, really horrible things happen? Could happen. Is the stability of maintaining this hateful, anti-Semitic, violent, terror-sponsoring, human rights abusing regime worth not having that upheaval? Because a lot of bad comes with that stability, that version of stability as well. So look, I really think we as non-Iranians should be modest and should be thoughtful and should show deference to how Iranians want their country and their society to be shaped. I wish well for the Iranian people. I think it's important, the rhetoric that's used, and again, I mentioned, I think the prime minister's over his skis a bit on this. That is not complicating things for Iranians who feel like maybe there's a moment. And we don't know if there will be a moment. If the fact that certain regime institutions will be weakened by strikes, their ability to do some of the repression, the fact that maybe their ability to spread their propaganda is weakened if the television studios hit, the fact that just that sense of weakness that could come. Well, it could come either from, the United States striking Fordo, or it could come from a concession that Iran might make on Fordo, which of course is a complicating factor, right? Maybe that is one of the things the Supreme Leader is afraid of, that if he shows that that weakness through concession, that will stir the appetite of people to rise up. But again, these are really questions that the Iranians will figure out. And again, I do pray for this regime's demise. It will be a good day on the world and a good day for Iranians when it's gone, even if we don't know what follows it.
Yeah, I hear that. And I think, my again, I'm with you. My concern is the thing like the bombing of the television stations or other targets that, the Israeli government has been identifying those as government targets in Iran, right? Which it is government-run television, but we've got government-run television in a lot of different countries. As far as I'm concerned, that doesn't make that a good target, but it's a different that's a different discussion. But I've got two things. First of all, I just want to remind everybody, please, if you have questions, to use the Q&A function, and that's how we will get your questions. A couple people have raised hands. We're not calling on folks. Use the Q&A. I want to bring it back to the U.S. politics for a minute because, again, we know now, okay, we've got a window, a week or two, whatever it is the president has said. And one of the things you mentioned that a decision for direct U.S. military involvement would be unpopular or at least split, the president's own party. There's, one of the other questions that's out there is really the war powers question, right? Congress has the power to declare war in the United States. You worked in Congress for a long time. You worked in the executive branch for a long time also. There is, bipartisan legislation in Congress right now. Senator Kaine in the Senate, Representative Massey and Khanna in the House, saying very clearly that, no U.S. offensive military actions can take place without the authorization of Congress. I won't even ask you this because I think that the White House doesn't care very much whether those resolutions pass one way or another. But do you think they should? And what do you think should be the process for a decision to commit to commit American troops, whether that's boots on the ground or planes or whatever that may be?
Yeah.
Process,
Well, it's always desirable.
politics about it, like where we are in the moment.
Yeah. 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 Look, it's always desirable as much as possible to have Congress as the representative of the American people to voice its views, and if that's going to happen, its support for military action. And I think there should be dialogue between the administration and Congress on that question and how it's done. This question of whether an administration requires a congressional authorization before engaging in any kind of offensive action, I think is one that where you stand on it often is where you sit, in that the legislative branch tends to be protective of its equities and the executive branch tends to be protective of its equities. I definitely know of members of Congress who became senior officials in administrations who had kind of a different view on this, or at least once they consulted their executive branch lawyers, they sounded different than they sounded when they sat in the Senate or in the House of Representatives. So that's kind of built into our system. I've served in both, as you said. I think I've always been, I think, uh, appreciative of the importance of a commander in chief having a certain degree of authority and flexibility to make these decisions, certainly on kind of time urgent things. But there are other ways, right? It doesn't require, even according to those who say that the president has this authority, an actual authorization from Congress. There are other ways Congress can speak to it. There are less than authorizing resolutions that can express some support and so forth. Again, there should be dialogue between the administration and Congress, and hopefully on a bipartisan basis. I don't know if the administration is talking to Democrats at all. They should, but there should be dialogue between the two branches of government to see if there's a way of having as much of the sense of the two branches on the same page as possible. I think as a practical matter, the president, if he decides to do this, will probably decide to do this and won't wait for, certainly won't ask for, no administration would ask for it, but won't wait for a congressional authorization. I think the correct way of most administrations then acting is they send what's called a war powers notification to Congress. They say it's consistent with, but not pursuant to the War Powers Act. They don't feel bound by the War Powers Act. They don't think it's constitutional. That's true of every administration. But as if it were, they will make their necessary reports, and then there's that information flow. Again, that's in normal times. I don't know if this administration will behave as most of his predecessors have. But I don't have a strong. I don't come down strongly on the requirement that Congress must authorize, and if not, the president can't act. But I also don't think it's a real world description of how this will unfold. But I do think you can at least narrow gaps and have information flow such that A, people know what the goal is going in, B, those who can express support for it do, whether it's through an authorizing resolution or some other less formal way. And yes, there will be opponents, right? You can't get unanimity. That's of course true, and maybe opponents in the president's party as well. But there is a certain amount of deference I certainly give us from my time in the White House and the State Department and the Pentagon to a president, a commander in chief, even one I wouldn't choose for this moment or at all, to make these kinds of decisions.
Yeah, thank you. I want to take a couple of the questions from the Q&A. I'm going to smush a few things together here for your consideration. So one, there's a question that I think is a very important one is, is there a danger of Israel exhausting its Iron Dome defense capacity? And if so, what role does the US have there in terms of that? And then beyond that, a lot of the conversation, some of the fear of this whole conflict, or of the US getting involved, is that, a broader regional war and what that might be. So, without going down the like worst case scenario too far, when people talk about that, what do you think that looks like? What's the capacity? I mean, you talked a little bit before, Syria is not really a functional government right now. Lebanon is trying to change. We know the Houthis are already involved, but what would that look like? So the Iron Dome question, and then what would a broader conflict entail?
Sure. So, just as a matter of my personal history, I've been, deeply involved in supporting and generating U.S. support for all of Israel's rocket and missile defense capabilities for a decade and a half. I was in the Obama administration and the NSC when the first funding for Iron Dome was provided, about $200 million. Congress provided it after the president requested it. And then shortly before I got to Israel as ambassador, it was the first intercept. And then we saw the build out of that system and the success it had in intercepting, 80 or 90% of what came. It saved just countless lives. Nothing I've worked on, frankly, in my entire government career has saved more lives than these missile defense systems. Iron Dome for sure for many years, and then now we're seeing the other ones, David Sling and Arrow 2 and Arrow 3. Now, most of the missiles, I should say missiles. Rockets and missiles are not the same thing. Rockets tend to be shorter range. They aren't guided in any way. And Iron Dome is generally what is used to defend against those from Gaza or from Lebanon. It's been adjusted. It can address somewhat longer range threats than it used to, but that's primarily what it's used for. The ballistic missiles coming from Iran, many of which exit the Earth's atmosphere on their way, can't be intercepted by Iron Dome. So they have the Arrow 2 and Arrow 3, just two different generations of the same system, all long-standing projects funded and co-developed with the United States, and another one called David Sling for slightly lower tier, but same kind of stuff. And they're very successful. Also, tend to have success rate in the sort of 90% range when these missiles are coming in. But you mentioned capacity, right? So there's two aspects of capacity. One is, and the Iranians have learned this, as others did before, that if you send a barrage of 50 or 100 simultaneously, you may be able to either overwhelm the radar that is trying to track all these different incoming ballistic missiles and confuse the defense, or you may just be able to saturate the defense so that there aren't enough interceptors available to get everything that's in the air, and something's going to get through. And in fact, I think Israel's acknowledged that, particularly in the October strike, they had to make choices. They couldn't defend every thing that was shot at, and some missiles did get through, thankfully without any fatalities. I think, although no, there was one. I can't remember. It was in April, October. There was a Palestinian killed in Jericho, of all places, because shrapnel fell and killed him. So this was so they have to make those kinds of choices. So one of the things the United States has been doing and has long practiced is how can the U.S. bring its own missile defense assets to bear to help supplement what Israel has and what we have helped them create. By the way, I should have mentioned the supplemental appropriations bill that passed in Congress last year that President Biden pushed very hard for included about $4.5 billion to replenish Iron Dome and Arrow 3 and Arrow 2 and a David Sling missiles, and also to help build the laser interceptor called Iron Beam, which is still in development but very close to being deployed. So, there's a huge amount, and then of course I negotiated with others the MOU in 2016 that provided a steady stream of funding of $500 million for these programs, and it's been supplemented several times as the need has arisen. So what the United States brings is two things. One is naval destroyers and cruisers that come to the Eastern Mediterranean and have ballistic missile capabilities called Aegis, and they can also shoot down missiles coming to Israel. And there's communication between the U.S. and Israeli defense, the military. Sometimes they're literally sitting next to each other in the same room to figure out who has the best shot, what's the best angle, and who actually downs it. And then after the second of those two attacks from Iran last year, the United States sent over a ground-based system called THAAD, which was deployed in October, was used a bit in the months between October and now to help intercept a few of the Houthi missiles that were launched at Israel. And now they brought in April a second THAAD battery, and that has a very significant number of interceptors together between that and what the U.S. has offshore and what Israel has in its Arrow 2 and 3 and David Sling inventory. There's a lot of interceptor capacity. And having said all of that, you have seen some missiles get through. The saturation problem, the number of missiles available in any given shot, and over time, if the Iranians have, and we think they do, something like 1,500, maybe they had a little more than that at the beginning, missiles available that can reach Israel. They don't have that many launchers. So what Israel is doing very assiduously is trying to take out the launchers to limit what they can send at any given time. But over time, that's a lot of firepower to bring. And the United States, Israel is very protective for good reasons about their exact inventories. Those are not numbers that should be known or widely discussed because obviously that helps the enemy. But there's a real concern. Some of this has now been written about in some published articles that there is real danger that over time those interceptor stocks will be depleted when Iran still has offensive capability. And so getting to an endpoint of this is important so you have more time to rebuild and restock. But that's something to worry about, and I do worry about it. Your second question was on how the war could widen, right? So, what the Iranians have hinted but not said explicitly is that if the United States intervenes, they don't want the United States involved, right? They know the United States can do a lot of damage, and so they haven't initiated anything that would cause us to get involved. They haven't attacked us or even sent their proxies to attack our bases. But they have hinted that if the United States is involved, there will be some response. And then I think today I saw for the first time one of the Iranian proxies, a dangerous group in Iraq, a Shia militia called Kataib Hezbollah, openly threatened that it would attack U.S. bases if in the Gulf or in Iraq if the United States gets involved. So this is the first thing they could do. They've got their proxy network, and then they've got thousands upon thousands of shorter range ballistic missiles that can reach the Gulf and reach bases in the UAE, Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Oman, where the U.S. has forces, and threaten Kuwait as well, and threaten U.S. troops that way. We have bases in Iraq and Syria as well. After Trump's strike to assassinate Qasem Soleimani, the former IRGC commander in 2020, they did respond with a ballistic missile barrage against a base in Iraq and caused injuries, traumatic brain injuries, mostly to some American personnel. Fortunately, nobody killed, but it was a very serious response. But that was all they did, and then that sort of wound it down. So there's that possibility. And then the question is, well, how bad are the results? If we suffer casualties, you can be sure we will respond, and we'll have to signal that ahead of time to try to deter this, but we'll have to respond forcefully. There may be ways to mitigate that and respond in a way that if the Iranians feel they have to respond to that, that you can get on a de-escalatory cycle rather than escalatory, but there's risk there. You have to worry about Iran deciding that they're going to broaden this by attacking the energy facilities of their Gulf neighbors. Israel so far has really only grazed any Iranian energy targets. They've hit one refinery and one depot in Tehran. And I think it's signaling that, if they're showing Iran they can do more, really damage the Iranian economy and the regime stability that it provides, if Iran responds in certain ways. But Iran could decide to initiate this. They could also do it by blockading the Strait of Hormuz or attacking ships going through there. And that's a risk to the global economy as well. So in any of those scenarios, undoubtedly the United States is going to have to be more involved and try to uh, demonstrate to Iran the costs of doing that are too high. And so there's risk of escalation for sure. But there are also means of managing that risk and mitigating that risk. Some of it is communicating to Iran what price they can pay, um, or their proxies can pay. The United States did attack several times while I was at the Pentagon, the Shia proxies in Iraq and Syria that had attacked U.S. forces. Of course, Israel took out Hezbollah. Both of us have attacked the Houthis in various ways. But some of that would have to come to Iran itself. And, it might mean attacking pillars of the regime that the supreme leader would feel he doesn't want to put at risk. Again, that's not a regime change strategy. That is a deterrent strategy to try to keep Iran's response, if there is one, or the proxy's response, measured and limited, and certainly to protect our people. I think already we're doing a lot of the preparation you would need to do for that by pulling people out. That's been publicly announced. Some of the family members and non-essential staff at embassies and on military bases are departing. There are various other ways you can harden those facilities and try to limit it. So maybe, God forbid, the attack comes, you absorb it with fewer or hopefully no casualties, and that means you have more decision space and flexibility in the U.S. response to that. But those are the things to worry about, and we should worry about it. And nobody should be pounding the war drums and saying, we should attack without acknowledging that risk and having serious military planners think through the ways of mitigating and managing that risk. And I think we have those people. I've worked with them in Central Command, CENTCOM. They're excellent. But at the same time, there's risk the other way, right? As I said earlier, there's risk if this ends with Iran with the ability to produce that nuclear weapon and deciding to do so.
First of all, I hope that those serious people you were talking about get listened to by whoever's ultimately making the decisions these days. Um, so look, there are a lot of challenges. You just touched on those. I want to we got a few minutes left. I want to think about the I don't know if the other side is the right phrase, but I want to think about the end game. What are the ways in which, again, if you just went kind of down some of the bigger threats, if this broadened out, what are the ways in which this could come to a conclusion sooner rather than later, and ideally with fewer deaths rather than more? Do you think that there's a line in which the Israelis would be willing to stop short of destroying all of the capacity? Again, I don't know if it's fair to ask you what you think President Trump is going to do, but I'll throw that in there. What are the ways that you think that this could possibly be wrapped up?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I think Israel has been pretty responsible in this case, and I don't know the detail of every strike, of course, but I think they've generally struck what are fairly considered legitimate targets. They've given a lot of warning and evacuation. They now have total air superiority there, so they don't need to worry as much about planes being shot down or even then forecasting what the next strike is. And that's created some opportunity for people to protect themselves. I'm sure there have been civilians killed. That happens in wars, and it's tragic when it does. And I don't minimize it, but I think their effort here is to try to minimize that to the maximum degree and to focus on the legitimate military targets. Um, I think the best outcome is President Trump's use of the threat of force, which we have to be prepared to use if necessary, but as a means to leverage Iran coming to the negotiating table. It sounds like he's now put that out there for a week or two, and making concessions that would essentially achieve the same goal through diplomatic means. Um, a lot of that depends on Iran. Will they cross a threshold they've not, I mean, a policy threshold and a diplomatic threshold they have not previously crossed their own red line and say, okay, we recognize that the risk of us continuing to try to maintain this enrichment program is that we're going to face very, very severe consequences. Could even have that sort of regime threatening quality, again, not by us, but more by internal means. And we'll put in place the restrictions and the verification of them airtight because they've often cheated or been less than forthcoming on their program in the past, and make that the off ramp. That to me is still an available off ramp, and if so, it will be a very successful example of diplomacy, of course, of diplomacy, which is part of diplomacy, of uh, leveraging both the military action that's been taken and the threat of more to get a better outcome. It involves Iranian leaders putting their own nation's well-being above this ideological commitment. They can have everything they want, right? They say they want. They can have peaceful nuclear energy. They can have the enriched uranium necessary for research and medical purposes. And there's still much to talk about. Their missile program, their support of terrorist organizations, right? That will also need to be dealt with, but I don't think it needs to be dealt with in the immediate term. But I do think we have a window here, and I'm cautiously encouraged that that's a window of opportunity that if everybody works toward it, we can get a much better outcome short of any kind of escalation. But again, you have to have that credible threat of force as part of that, and a credible threat of force is only credible if you're willing to use it, and so that also has to be part of the president's decision space. I'm not, again, demanding he do it or saying he must do it. I'm just saying the outcome we need is Iran not being able to build a nuclear weapon. And there are a couple different ways to get there. I said there are probably three ways to get there with respect to the Fordo facility to buy the most time on this. And one of those is I think going to have to be used, but this is the best one.
Yeah. Well, I think, we all are in agreement on that end game, that they cannot have cannot have the capacity, cannot have those nuclear weapons. I think we all agree on that, and I'm sure we all agree that we want to get there with the least loss of life possible. Um, and I'm hoping that, as you said, the Iranian leadership is willing to make those decisions, and the American leadership and the Israeli leadership, that they too are, putting the best, putting their nations first and not their personal interests necessarily as well.
For sure.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much. We appreciate you coming. We appreciate you, sharing your expertise with us and answering questions. Thank you to everyone who joined us, and we'll see you all another time.